Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning back in. This is going to be I don't know about long awaited, but long overdue return back to the Rocky recap section of our show. And I've been wanting to get back to this for quite some time, but I had this idea that I should have things released in chronological order, and unfortunately it's been quite a few months since I have put one of these out, because the one that I wanted to put out, I think right around the June mark, had some stuff that I needed to research, and I just hadn't gotten around to it. And very quickly, it got away from me and got to the point where I was so far behind. Like, I have all of these notes. I have quite a few recordings, actually, and I just haven't put them out. So I'm going to step outside of chronological order for now, in the interest of getting some content out there and in keeping an eye on our dear friend Rocky and his stumbling journey through just how far he can operate outside of a real relationship with truth before someone, or the audience generally, catches on to what he's doing.
Somebody has to be accountable for what they say.
Thanks, Rocky. And, again, I don't think Rocky's intentionally lying. I just think he's profoundly misinformed and is not a reliable source of information, and should not be taken seriously on just about anything he has to say.
I may be wrong.
Thanks, Rocky. So this is for September 24th, 2022. And Rocky starts off, as he usually does, with some form of gratitude, saying, what a day to be here, and, what a time to be alive, and talks about how this time differs from previous times, just sort of usual contemplative openings that you would expect to hear on this program. So he goes on to say, we need to tell them that enough is enough. And, he says it's all about power. It's darkness against light. And he says it's not left versus right, it's power versus darkness. That's kind of weird. It's not a real one-to-one dichotomy there. Power versus darkness. What does that even mean? Does that imply that darkness is inherently weak? Does that imply that power can only be good? Totalitarian governments throughout history certainly wielded a lot of power. So what is this power versus darkness? I mean, Rocky sort of shoots from a hip when it comes to talking, so maybe this is just a slip of some kind. But it's very strange, especially considering that he's very into law and order. He might be more comfortable with authoritarianism than he even realizes, but who knows? He goes on to say it's freedom versus liberty. Kind of strange. Being free versus being confined, to obey and to submit. I think the general direction of what he's saying here is, it's freedom versus tyranny, that sort of thing. And he's just sort of stumbling in terms of actually getting that out there. So we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt here. And, I agree it's freedom versus tyranny, but I definitely don't think he's on the side of freedom, having experienced far more freedom than he could ever dream of. It's hard not to see him more on the tyranny side of things, despite his generally nominally libertarian leanings. And he talks about how Italy is going to the polls on the 26th of September, and hopefully things will change because the left is darkness. I thought it wasn't about left versus right. I thought it was about darkness versus power. I mean, are we already mixing up our terms here? Are we already getting incoherent? Well, maybe. So it's interesting that he brings up Italy, because the far-right candidate that is representing a party that literally used the same logo as the MSI, or Italian Social Movement. And that party was the literal successor of Mussolini's fascist party. But, okay, Rocky, maybe it's the left that's the darkness. Just because you use a logo that was associated with Mussolini's successor party doesn't necessarily mean that you're fascist, but it really does invite that criticism. So if you're going to say, oh, well, we're not actually fascist, it's like, well, why are you using that symbol? It's sort of like saying, well, we're not Americans, but we're using the American flag. I mean, we're not We're not Nazis, but we're using the swastika. We're not communists, but we're using the hammer and sickle. Certain symbols mean certain things. And so when those exist, a thinking person has to wonder, well, why do they exist in that way? But realistically, Rocky probably just has no idea that there's a graphical similarity at all. And when I say graphical similarity, I mean it is the exact same logo with different text around it. So, not great, but, oh well. So, don't forget, it's the left that's darkness. Rocky says that the Italian citizens stood up and declared that they wanted to obey the laws and elected this person, which is kind of strange. You're like, oh yeah, it's freedom, blah, blah, blah. These people wanted to follow the laws. And yeah, there's a balance between laws and no laws in a society, but it's just kind of a weird place to jump to when you're talking about freedom. It's a little weird, maybe represents a misunderstanding of the relationship between laws and freedom, but whatever. That's his own personal perspective. And then he talks about how the rulers won't obey. The leaders will go on private jets, but you have to ride a bicycle. And yeah, Rocky, power structures are bad. And I think you'd agree, if not for the fact that you're constantly talking about your law and order fixation. If that's what you want, he says, by all means, keep voting that way. Keep voting to have this hypocrisy upon you. And unfortunately, no matter which way you vote, the hypocrisy of the ruling class does not change. Regardless of who you vote for, it is a fixture of state politics in and of itself. So he goes on to talk about saying, the border is great, the cops are happy, recruitment of the police and military is fine. He says this with a heavy sarcasm, of course, and it's amazing, Rocky, that people don't want to join these cruel and corrupt and often abusive institutions. What a tragedy. It's amazing, when people start to learn about what goes on all the time around them, there are effects and consequences of that. It's almost as if, Rocky, if you decided to learn something, you might have different opinions about things, and you might act on those opinions rather than stomping your feet and acting as if you have the only definitive truth and have nothing to learn, nothing to gain, and you'll just walk away from any disagreement. But, maybe have a little bit of intellectual courage. Maybe. Probably not.
It doesn't work with me.
So, he talks about illegally immigrating in other countries versus us. Switzerland is actually one of his favorite examples for this thing. He brings this up pretty frequently. He says, Switzerland, try to do that there. You can't even make a step in there without the documents. Rocky says this, like I said, pretty regularly over the course of my listening to his show, and he still doesn't seem to realize that Switzerland is actually part of the Schengen zone, an area where there are no internal passport controls or visas, by which I mean you can literally walk into Switzerland and you'll be fine. Rocky, yet again, demonstrating he has no idea what he's talking about. In the meantime, he says, we love our families and we are blessed, and yeah, same. I'm doing pretty well, but I'm not sure how this is relevant to the last point. It's just sort of he's jumping to a random subject here. But we jump to a subject just beyond that. He talks about how Lee was in D.C. recently, in the capital of our nation. And he walked just beyond the center of the city a little bit to see that D.C., for miles, is a bit of a dump. And, we should be ashamed of this, according to Rocky. And I think to some degree, yes, we should be ashamed, but perhaps for very different reasons. As I said to Lee, D.C. is a propaganda piece. It's an illusion of grandeur surrounded by the harsh reality of what life in America is like for an ever-growing number of us. For the people that can afford to go there, Washington, D.C. is a place where you can get lulled back into a sense of loyalism and purpose and American supremacy by big shiny buildings and big fancy stories. It's a place where you are meant to be inspired and impressed. It is literally a piece of architectural propaganda, just in the same way as any major or capital city will have its central district to attract investment and to attract interest and to attract tourism. DC is much the same way, but rather than tourist dollars, which that's of course part of it because it's a city, the deeper purpose of Washington, D.C. is to inspire that power. So, yeah, the fact that that's the center of D.C., and all around it you see this ever deepening, ever worsening slum, because that's where the help lives, that's an incredibly true, an incredibly powerful symbol, a microcosm of the culture of America itself. This is a place where if you can afford to go to the nice places, you can be lulled into believing that that's what it's like, that's what it's supposed to be, and not realizing what it's built on the backs of, and not realizing what it's meant to distract you from. Anyways, Rocky goes on to start talking about all the people at MSNBC and how they should walk around without bodyguards. So, yeah, I mean, this is probably tangentially related to the fact that he was talking about how dangerous certain parts of D.C. are, and many cities like it, and these folks tend to be anti-gun, and, many of the elite folks that are anti-gun also happen to have armed security, so of course I'm sympathetic to calling out that hypocrisy, but also, I mean, sure, yeah, these people shouldn't have security while also demanding that we be disarmed, but that's the same kind of hypocrisy that you're going to see in any position of power. It's not especially unique to people from MSNBC. It's just a talking point. It's just a figure that Rocky can put up and punch a few times in order to signify his virtue. I mean, you can say the same thing about quite a few politicians. You can say the same thing about sports figures. You can say the same thing about tons of different people. Anyways, there's a big difference between the ruling class and the working class, and that's frustrating. That's that gap in safety that exists and that gap of protection that exists is a serious factor to consider. But you won't necessarily ever hear Rocky engaging in a systemic analysis where you say, well, the police tend to defend the rich from the poor, and that contradiction becomes very evident when the poor decide they want to stop starving in the ditches. Anyway, Rocky talks about tent cities and says if you don't like this, you need to vote the Democrats out. So the alternative is they all go to jail, I guess? I mean, neither party solves the issue of poverty. One is more tolerant in the display of that poverty, but the other just puts them in jail so they can't be seen by the investment class. Rocky goes on to talk about saying, whom in my audience would believe that Guam could capsize, but they do. They, of course, referring to the Democrats, or as he calls them, the left, the Marxists, the communists, whatever you want to call them in that any given day. So, this is a comment, of course, this is referencing a comment by Hank Johnson of Georgia, who was roundly mocked and the rest of the world moved on. But Rocky thinks it's still something to bring up. This is a comment from 2010. In fairness to Representative Johnson, he did say his question was meant to be humorous to draw attention to the real issue, where an influx of 8,000 Marines to the small island of Guam would need new infrastructure to support them, meaning, including construction crews and support personnel, the population of this island of 180,000 would increase by 79,000 people, causing severe logistical challenge on their resources, especially their water infrastructure. Rep. Johnson followed up by saying, and I quote, "The subtle humor of this obviously metaphorical reference to a ship capsizing illustrated my concern about the impact of the planned military buildup on this small tropical island." Whether or not Rep. Johnson was being silly or is just an idiot is not really all that relevant here, especially given that it happened so long ago, but it's a bad look, and folks like Rocky will talk about it for the next 12 years. Rocky goes on, as he often does, to talk about anti-evolution perspectives and how we can't ever change the environment. This is a laughable claim, of course, because one only needs to look at the levels of anxiety drugs in the water off the coast of major cities, changing the behavior of fish, and the disappearing reservoirs around the world, or how the Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean, to understand that we can affect our ecosystem.
I may be wrong.
You can see how before we took action, acid rain was damaging stone buildings and smog reduced visibility in and around cities, and how things changed when a 20th century Republican decided maybe we could be a little more responsible with the gift of creation. Radical thinking, I know, but please stick with me for a second.
It doesn't work with me.
Rocky talks about how volcanoes are so much more powerful than us, and how they had to reroute planes for volcanoes, but they don't have to reroute planes for pollution, seemingly talking about how pollution is no big deal. A little strange logically, especially considering there is a very simple reason for this, Rocky, and being an Italian, you should know. Man-made pollution can be caustic and very problematic in the long term, but volcanic ash is literally a mixture of profoundly toxic superheated gas and literal shards of glass. You don't need to be an aeronautic engineer to know that you shouldn't be sucking glass into your engine. That's a bad move. You should probably fly around that giant column of literal superheated gas and tiny little pieces of glass that will shred your engine, your gaskets, your fuel lines, and so on. Pollution doesn't so much do that. Different things, but as usual, the comparisons and the metaphors don't really work on this show, and they exemplify a deeper ignorance of the broader subject matter. Rocky talks about Bill Gates and sending a shield into space to shelter the sun, and how absurd it is, and how pointless it is, and how we can't put faith in ideas like this. And, here, we will agree. I too think it's absurd, and I don't think we can trust ideas like this, but I don't think it's absurd because we can't change our environment. I think it's absurd because it's more feasible for us to send a giant mirror into space to literally block the sun than it is for us to move away from techno-industrial capitalism. In a society that runs off of literally throwing the living nature into a wood chipper and spitting out dead commodities, that's not something that I think we should keep doing, but it's more feasible to us to shoot a mirror into space that's God knows how big.
They don't care. They're rip-offs.
And, far be it from me to understand space engineering, but how big does something like that have to be in order to have any effect on global temperature? And possibly, more importantly, how do we account for the effect of the shielding on sunlight interfering with the photosynthesis process and converting of CO2 into oxygen through cellular respiration? Thus, having a problem fighting the greenhouse effect. You fly a shield into space, and in so doing, you interrupt plants, never mind the crops, from doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so you're going to have a reduction in the efficiency of our natural systems to create a carbon cycle. So that's kind of a problem. And then how do you keep the crops growing? Well, I guess you can have artificial light. Well, how do you power the artificial light? Do you burn fossil fuels, or do you use solar power? Oh, wait, you can't. This all seems very dumb, but that's the thinking of the global elites generally. I mean, they're super wealthy capitalists that live in this alternate world where they can just sort of do things and get investments and not really change anything. And they can only see change through the lens of their capitalist worldview, which is why their solutions for capitalism are only ever more capitalism. Sort of like how a drug addict will say the solution for their problem is just more drugs. It's not a winning argument, in my opinion. Rocky continues with his anti-evolution rhetoric by saying, I will say it again, there is not one scientific proof. Do you know what I mean? Not one time can they give you the full scope of evolution. I'm not sure what he means by the full scope of evolution, but it's constantly playing out around us, and we can literally see it happening in real time. So I have no idea what Rocky is saying here, but as we say, narrative over facts on the Rocky Radio Show. He says, if you want to espouse it presumably being evolution, then he doesn't care. But I think you do, Rocky. You talk about respecting different perspectives, and yet you fly off the handle anytime you're challenged. He talks about how no one died at or no police officers, I should say, died at the Capitol riot on January 6th. And, this has some debate and challenges about the causality of the deaths of the officers, but the law and order crowd is normally foaming at the mouth over cops getting injured. So this fixation on whether or not they died feels really awkward and really disingenuous and frankly incredibly opportunistic. He says the audience of 94.9 is very well informed, and they seem to broadly be more informed than most talk radio audiences, but that is in no part thanks to you, Rocky. They're well informed despite you, not because of you. we need to get back to basics, he says. And, sure, Rocky, especially since you can't even get those right, going back to basics is probably a pretty good idea. John calls in about how climate change is a lie and says he has proof. In 1965, there was a National Geographic exploration of the North Pole, and he talks about how the maps of ice are 1,000 miles north of where they are now. But he says you can't find this online. It's been censored. I tried to find it online, and I didn't find what he was talking about, so who knows? I do have an extensive collection of National Geographic somewhere at my father's house, and maybe I'll poke around through it and see what I can find. But, in the meantime, I looked around for this, and the only map from 1965 I can find of the Arctic from National Geographic is called The Top of the World. It's from November 1965, and you can have a look for it if you like. But they don't display ice at all on this map, so I'm not really sure if this is the one he's referring to. I assume he's not just referring to Greenland as the North Pole being smaller, because I assume he's more literate at maps than that, but I don't know. I don't know the guy. I'm going to assume, giving him the benefit of the doubt, that's not what he's talking about. But, depending on whether or not he knows how to read map scales, this particular map projection does distort the distance and scale pretty heavily. So if he's not accounting for that, there may be some more room for honest error. People don't understand that when you take a sphere and mush it onto a flat plane, there's always distortion in a map. And that's why they have these different projections of the map. Some people like a northern dominant perspective of the map, and that's the one that makes Russia look like it's longer than everything and Antarctica look like it's the largest continent, and that's because you're smushing the top across a flat plane. So maps can be a little bit difficult, but this is not a cartography podcast, and the Rocky Radio Show is certainly not a cartography show. So let's keep going here. Rocky talks about how it's important to find this in a library. Surely they still have some around, and John says he's seen it and he actually has a copy. Rocky, of course, says that he needs to see it as well, and John says he can't give it to him. But John says he might be willing to show it to him. And Rocky says, take a picture, send it his way. He does get this email later in the show, but he says it's too pixelated to see, which is kind of interesting. Mother Nature, he says, is rejoicing, according to Rocky. And, it's an interesting reference to paganism, but okay. And he says, do you ever wonder how the birds know where to go? And yeah, absolutely. It's one of the great mysteries of science. There are some people who have a range of theories. The more popular include genetic memory, sensitivity to magnetic fields, and the following of older members of their flock. These are all possibilities. There are additional possibilities, of course, but it's not as if there aren't other competing explanations that have some plausible basis. Rocky meanders a little bit about religion and then talks about the Billy Falcon song, How Dare You Touch What God Has Made. And I don't know, man, but you really seem to not be worried about touching the environment that God made. He talks about how everyone has to obey God's plan of life, birth, death, and yeah, sure, everyone does. Here we are. The Great Equalizer, death, and the Colt Peacemaker, of course. So he says, do I talk about religion too much? Apparently some people have been telling Rocky he talks about religion too much, and at this point I actually emailed him saying, don't worry about those people. I do outreach to Rocky every once in a while, and he consistently ignores me. I guess it's just my way of saying, I'm trying to reach out for a civil dialogue, and it's just not going to happen. Anyway, Rocky talks more about global warming fraud, saying that they're trying to deceive you, and how you can see a polar bear in this photo on a little float of ice. And so apparently this photo is cropped in such a way that there's a big ice mountain behind it, leading a lot of people to say that this is a dishonest framing of the issue at the North Pole, and that actually everything is really fine up there. And that may be the case for that photo, but I'll tell you what, I've seen video, and this video is of a polar bear so profoundly emaciated from the fact that it didn't have any food to eat because it was stuck on a little ice floe, that it was dragging its back feet behind it because they had stopped working. That polar bear went up to a piece of trash that was stuck on the ice float near it, a piece of styrofoam, and proceeded to eat it out of sheer desperation for something to fill its stomach with. Now again, you can also say that was staged. Maybe, I don't know. But it's not as if there aren't photographic evidence and images of something being very profoundly wrong at the poles. We can also talk about temperature readings being close to 80 degrees in some situations, especially in the Antarctic, and that's pretty concerning. That's not really a polar temperature, but, what do I know? I'm not a climatologist. I'm also not an explorer anymore, so who knows? Maybe I could just be very, very off base. Jim calls in and talks about how it's important to talk about God and says that people think they can Google things, but there's so many different versions and there's real truth in God. And this is a little ironic because even within Christianity, there are many different interpretations and even different Bible translations. That's not even counting the other Abrahamic religions that worship basically the same God. And beyond that, countless other faiths beyond just the Abrahamic. So, I mean, I don't know what he's trying to say here. It doesn't work as a metaphor. And so Jim says God is the true north, and then talks about how even a ship's compass doesn't point to true north. And Rocky says, yeah, God does that. God's the one who directs it. And yikes, man. A sailor in the Italian Navy that doesn't know the difference between true north and magnetic north? Yikes, that's a little weird, because that's the point Jim was trying to make, but Jim sort of dropped it because it's not productive to contradict Rocky on the show, or especially maybe expose a pretty jarring lack of understanding of navigation. Yeah, I don't know. So he says that Jim says Rocky is making a great point about the founders and about God. And, many of our founders had religious beliefs, but not all of them. And most of them endorsed religious pluralism, so they kind of were tolerant of plenty of other religions. I mean, the phrase Mahometan comes up in some of our founding documents, talking about how we want to be a secular society. And that's, not really talked about by the right all that much. But, it was an understanding of a desire to have a place where people from all over the world could come to contribute to this American project. And there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson that says, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." And Rocky says that he is authentic, but the left isn't, and they need trickery and subterfuge, which is ironic, again, because the right wing has a media machine the likes of which the left could never even dream of being allowed to have, and their beliefs crumble under even the slightest scrutiny. But sure, we're the deceivers, Rocky, sure. Rocky then goes on to say, if you're an anarchist, or if you're a communist, just say it. Say, I'm a communist, I'm a Marxist, I love what China is doing. Say that if it's what you believe. Well, it's not. I'm an anarchist. I'm not a communist. I'm not a Marxist. I am not broadly okay with what China is doing. They have some things that are interesting, and they have some things that I oppose, because any country and any government is going to have a variety of directions, some of which you might like and some of which you don't, because that's how the world works. Nothing is purely good or purely evil. It's just kind of silly. It's a Disney way of viewing the world. Rocky urges people to call in if they're anarchists or communists. And, they're starting to zero in on maybe he's referring to a certain anarchist or person that he thinks is a communist. Maybe. We'll see how things go. And so he just says, say it like it is. And, I've tried calling into Rocky, and I always say it like it is. But you've shown, Rocky, that you can't handle a civil conversation. And you know what? I've got enough toddlers in my life. This is a talk radio show, he says. Don't email, call in. I'm not sure why you're so reluctant to reply to an email. It's kind of weird. But you had no issue talking to me via email before you decided I was the devil. If you keep your mouth shut during God Bless America, he says, say you hate God. Say it. Call in. Again, say you hate God. Say you hate God? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, that's such a bizarre leap, and you're trying to create this straw man. You're trying to create this caricature of someone who is opposed to your ideas in order to attack that person, rather than actually engage with that person and understand what they believe, maybe find some common ground, but maybe go separate ways at the end because you're different people, and that's fine. But at least a dialogue happened. So yeah, I mean, it's at this point that it's very clear that he's talking about me. I was recently at a party for the radio station, and I didn't sing along with God Bless America because, honestly, I'm not much of a singer, and the singer got the lyrics so wrong on several occasions that I was visibly laughing at this virtue-signaling display of loyalism. I find it odd that someone seems so deeply triggered by me not singing a song, but whatever. You know, and he said he got an email about these ice caps from the guy he was speaking to earlier, and he says it's too pixelated, he can't see it, whatever. So Bill calls in and identifies himself as an engineer and talks about how his background as an engineer coincides with his belief in God. And Rocky says they don't want us to espouse that, you know, that an engineer can believe in God. And I have no problem with that. I mean, come on. People have all sorts of perspectives, and that perspective is broadly harmless. Why would I have an issue with that? You know, it's frustrating. And he says, you know, we need to have folks call in, even if you disagree. And sorry, Rocky, you proved that, you know, you can't have a civil discourse when I called in to draw attention to the dangers of a blood-drenched document that one of your callers was telling people to read. I wasn't even disagreeing with you. I was just bringing something up. You couldn't even handle that without flying off the handle and screaming about the Soviet Union when I was talking about Imperial Russia. They're not the same thing. But, you know, far be it from you to understand that. You think Putin's a communist. Anyway, Rocky talks about fish and how the scales are incredible, and if you don't see God in this, you're not looking, you're just going along. You can recognize beauty without having a solidified explanation or being open to various possibilities, but there he goes, denigrating other people's perspectives, and he asks, how can you explain love? And there are many explanations for love. There's the creationist one, but there's also an example of it being a beneficial trait that help people pass down those traits to future generations. If love exists, you're going to have a stronger familial bond that'll make a more cohesive unit to survive in nature. You're going to take care of your kids more. You're going to take care of each other in elder years so you can pass down knowledge to future generations. It's a beneficial trait. And so if the evolutionary perspective is in fact correct, then love as a trait that would evolve and grow fits very neatly within that. Is that the way it happened? I don't know, maybe. But it's at least plausible. But it doesn't matter if it's plausible or not. Rocky doesn't care because it doesn't fit in with his pre-designated worldview. He says, I will respect disagreements, and no, you don't. You say all the time, you'll just walk away if you don't agree with someone, and you regularly call people that you disagree with evildoers and sons of Satan. You can't have it both ways. Rocky says he's not afraid, and that he's truthful, and his stories are consistent. And I'm sure you think you're truthful, and I've never had, you know, if you never do any actual research and verify your sources, it's easy to accidentally lie to an audience of thousands. And being consistent is also easy if you banish any information that doesn't line up with your worldview. He says if we have common ground, that's good, and he's blessed. If we don't have common ground, he's cursed. I mean, what are we supposed to get out of this? Another caller calls in and talks about Rocky's campaign. And because Rocky doesn't want the radio show to be taken away from him prematurely, he says we have to talk about something else. And so he brings up the Rotary in Norwich. Great radio, Rocky. Let's talk about road infrastructure. Sue calls in a little bit later and talks about her Bible fellowship camp in New Hampshire. I think she said it was called Romney Camp, which is a little interesting considering I'm 99% sure Romney is a Mormon. whatever, who knows? Could just be a coincidence in name. Either way, she goes on to talk more about this Rotary. Apparently, this Rotary in Norwich is unpopular. Rocky talks more about religion, and of course that's fine, and a new caller comes in and says all these Rotaries are part of a global initiative with bike lanes and something called transportation villages, and says we need to get rid of the mayor of Norwich is going along with all of this, and apparently planning out your cities in an effort to make them work better is globalism? God help us. He goes on to say city planners are globalist plants. I mean, this is getting into witch hunt territory of like, he's a globalist. No, he's a globalist. Everyone's a globalist. Well, what do we do now? Sometimes people adopt and encourage technologies because they make things more efficient, like roads or traffic signs or stoplights. These things have a purpose and their use is generalized because they improve things. And Rotaries in America are a little bit awkward because we're not used to them, but once people get used to them, they are a lot more efficient and they do reduce traffic deaths. But Americans are very reluctant to do any sort of changes because we're creatures of habit. That sort of includes me to a large degree. So the next caller calls in and says that she agrees with him about the Rotaries and says she wants to email him because she's never actually sent an email before. And so they sort of talk about how to send an email, and it's all very cute and endearing. And Rocky says this nation will never be under communism. And, maybe not. With the rate the capitalists are crushing people, interest in socialism and communism is the highest it's been since the Depression, a time where the communist movement in America was very prominent. Something history books, for some reason, don't talk about. Rocky says it's not his responsibility to convert people or convince them of his ideas, and that's kind of weird. It's weird to feel that way if you're trying to change the world and spread the beliefs that you claim to be good. It seems like a blatant rejection of the classic brother's keeper story. You are your brother's keeper. That's the whole point of the story, and that lesson is very clear in the text. But, what do I know? Because apparently I hate God. Rocky says he will close the show with God Bless America and talks about how the singer at the event he was at sang very, very well.
Please don't say that again.
And he says we sang, except for a few people, but that's okay. Well, apparently it's not okay from what I've heard. Suddenly it's okay? Lee told me and the whole audience that you were furious. So he didn't say it was you, but we all know pretty much who he was referring to, especially considering he was glaring at me several times throughout the entire evening. We sort of all put it together, especially given the sort of long-standing dispute that happens. There's only so many people that will fly off the handle about someone not singing a magical song. Anyway, the singer for the event was seemingly a Marilyn Monroe impersonator and sang in a style very similar to her Happy Birthday, Mr. President song. I've never heard such a doped-up, sexualized rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner and God Bless America. Especially during God Bless America, my wife and I noticed 3 lyrical errors. She said, "Through the oceans white with fire," and on 2 separate occasions said, "Through the light with the night from above." See, it's hard for me even to say it backwards, but she said it backwards somehow. I don't know what to make of that. Maybe it's all part of the Marilyn Monroe late career performance, but it's kind of weird to me. That's... Simulated opiate-laced slurring aside, it was not something I found remotely appropriate, and I'm not a nationalist in any way, but it kind of came off as very awkward and inappropriate. I also have my own feelings about the appropriateness of calling down the blessings of God on a specific country. It's as weird to me as 2 sides of a battle praying for the destruction of the other side. It feels like a pretty unchristian concept, but what do I know? This singer Rocky played did a much better rendition. Very heartfelt, very powerful. It was a good rendition of the song. That's not my favorite song by a mile, but he did a great job and put a lot of passion and feeling into it. It was genuine. And Rocky says he has goosebumps and ends his show, of course, in the usual way. You know, I haven't done a Rocky recap in a very long time, and I've fallen too far behind to try to release these in chronological order anymore. So hopefully I'll clear that backlog sometime down the line, but I think I'll try to get this out sooner rather than later. It's really weird to focus on the Rocky Radio Show because it's so repetitive. It's strange, you know, especially since I haven't been putting out content, catching up with the show as it goes, like just taking these notes every time of, oh, he's saying this again. Have I referenced this in the podcast, or do I still have it in notes? I mean, how many times is he going to reference the same topic in the wrong way, or how many times is he going to commit these easily verifiable factual errors? And like, this isn't a partisan thing. It's like, this is just objectively wrong. How many times is he going to do that? Seems there's no limit. But, you know, I'll stick with doing this as best as I can, because I think it's important to challenge the deceivers and charlatans of the world. I think it's important to be a reality check on the bombastic ramblings of a Bircherite ideologue who has no idea what he's talking about most of the time. I think it's important to counter speech with speech, and that's exactly what I'm doing here, and that's exactly what I hope to continue doing. I really appreciate your continued listenership to this, and if this is something you'd like to support, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/AFTONOMIA, Autonomia. Also, Patreon is spelled Patreon. You can sign up there to help sponsor the show, cover some of the bills, and give me a little bit more time to actually do this rather than recording it on the way to and from work or to and from the dump, that sort of thing. You know, maybe up the production values a little bit. And more importantly, support a lot of the charities that I like to support and the other podcasts that help bring content to the main program. You'll hear me reference other shows quite a bit because that's a big part of the worldview that I exist within, you know, exploring those other people's ideas and borrowing from those analyses. And I want to try to give back to that because I appreciate it. And that's a whole lot easier if I can, A, direct other people in that direction, and B, have some additional income that I can use to give more support to those podcasts. You know, I think it's really important to support libertarian left media because it's not something you're going to encounter because the system is so skewed against you, and people like Rocky think the MSNBC is communist. I mean, it's absurd. Anyway, I've rambled long enough, but thank you so much for your patience in all of this, and thank you so much for your continued interest. I really appreciate it. Feel free to message the page anytime or send a message to autonomiapod@gmail.com. Pretty sure that's the address. I've changed the address a few different times, and I guess probably the most reliable way for the moment is to message the Facebook page. So, anyways, once I get all that figured out, we'll have something a little more consistent. But thanks again for your listenership. Have a great day.
I eat meat and drive trucks and shoot guns and don't trust in the federal government to solve our problems. You might think I'm joking, but I'm not.